So for my presentation, for my first one I decided to do childhood trauma and childhood obesity, and then for my second one, um, I did like mental health effects on like adolescence and early adulthood. I tied in a little bit of childhood trauma, but I tried to focus on something that you see a lot more common these days, which is negative things happening within adult relationships. And I feel like a lot of that always relates back to childhood trauma. So I decided to do how childhood trauma affects adult relationships. So to start, what is trauma? Um, I think a lot of people think that trauma, they always think of it like physically. It's not always physically. A lot of it's emotionally and has effects, over your lifetime. Um, and um, trauma can be different for everybody else, and its effects can affect people differently. Someone can withstand a lot of trauma and not have a lot of, mental health issues, or it can affect them emotionally. And then someone could, you know, withstand something a much smaller trauma-wise on like a scale, and then um, it lead to further things. So some studies that I did, 61% of adult patients with mental illnesses experience some form of childhood trauma. That's over 5 out of 10 people. I think this was a broader study, but I feel like when you think about it a lot of people say they've had trauma, whether it's their childhood or adulthood. But when you speak to adults, a lot of them say they always relate back to something happening within their childhood, whether it was them personally or something they experienced with their parents, a relative, whether it's a car accident or domestic violence situation, things like that. So I did two other studies by different sources. One of them found that 61% of psychiatric patients, to be specific, had experienced at least one childhood traumatic event. They didn't go into detail about what that was or what they found more common, but in one of the next slides, I have a chart that I pulled up. And then another study found that 70%, so even more than this, of adults in the United States specifically have experienced trauma at some point in their lives, and that trauma often began in their childhood. It did say that it related to other things in their future life, but it didn't go into much detail. So this was a nice little chart that I found of a lot of things, of what can happen due to trauma. Obviously, it's different for everybody else, or for each person, but a lot of things like cognitive development, specific brain development, a big thing that you see in adults is their behavioral changes, mental health, and obviously effects on relationships. It also goes into physical health as well, but I'm going to be focusing on behavior, mental health, and main relationships. But a lot of common experiences that people say they've spoken or have experienced as children when you're speaking to them as adults. A big one, and I can show a chart in a future slide, but a big one was substance abuse in their guardians or parents, sexual abuse, emotional negligence, incarcerated household members was really far up there. I feel like that often seems to lead to like a disconnect in other personal relationships. Verbal and emotional abuse, divorces at a young age can have a huge effect as well. So this is the chart I was talking about, and I really like this chart because it clearly shows there's a lot of different common things, but a really big one was like household substance abuse. That was at 28% of them, which is really high. I feel like that often leads to other things listed. A lot of the time when substance is involved, whether it's drugs or alcohol, tend to lead to other negative behavior in the household, whether it's the parents or the child. Heightened emotions, heightened anger tends to lead to other violent situations, poor communication. So I feel like that's a big one because it also leads to other things and leads for people to act in different ways, and other issues in the house or other issues around siblings, things like that. The next one right under it, only 2% less, was physical abuse. Um, I feel like this kind of loops in with sexual abuse, which is down to 21, but I feel like they kind of tie in a lot together. Um, a lot of people mention physical abuse when they're talking about childhood trauma, and I think a big part of that is when it becomes physical for people, they tend to not want to speak about it as much and not go into detail, and I feel like um, that can really lead to trust issues in relationships and feeling like you're going to be judged for sharing personal experiences or how you feel. And I feel like that's a big part of it, which can lead to other issues in those relationships, which I'll get to. But mainly focusing on childhood trauma, common ones. It's going to be these. There's even like we spoke about emotional negligence. This says battered mother, but parental issues or parents that aren't present all the time can lead to other issues with how children act in school, things like that. That can also set them on a less fortunate path for their future, which can overall affect their life path as well. So we focused more on just childhood trauma, common experiences and things that happened, our definitions and things, but now I'm going to get into how it actually directly relates to adult relationships. So a lot of ways that childhood trauma can show through adult relationships. I've written a few out of many, but main ones being trust issues, toxic attachment styles, communicational challenges, emotional dysregulation, fear of intimacy is a big one, unhealthy relationship patterns, overthinking, jealousy, controlling behavior. I think a big one that you see is you'll hear a lot about like mommy issues or daddy issues. That kind of relates to the idea that people tend to look for what they were missing sometimes in a parent, or they search for their comfort spot, either if that was a parent. So they search for someone like their parent, which can sometimes be more negative than positive. So that's a main thing in itself. Once you get into like overthinking, jealousy, controlling behavior, a lot of people tend to have trust issues because people that they thought they could trust in the past, like let's say as a child, a relative, a parent, weren't there for them, hurt them, whether it was physically, sexually, emotionally. That's going to cause trust issues for such an underdeveloped mind. And not being able to fully understand the situation and still learning, those key points of relationships at a young age, with other relationships in their life. Like trust is a huge thing. And if that trust is broken with important relationships in your past, it's definitely going to develop into your future relationships. So when you're looking into more of romantic relationships, it tends to become more negative because you're always thinking, oh, I don't fully trust them, they're lying to me, they're not telling me the truth, they're gonna hurt me. So that's when you get into like that fear of intimacy, fear of progressing further in your relationship, furthering the growth in your relationship. There's always that fear of intimacy, but fear of growth in the relationship because you're scared you're gonna get hurt like past relationships, even if they weren't romantic. And then obviously like communication challenges. If you didn't grow up in a household seeing your parents in a healthy relationship, teaching you how to communicate, teaching you how to love, teaching you how to speak to people or talk about certain things that come up in relationships. If you don't have that like really healthy prime example, it's going to be hard to learn how to communicate or love somebody else when you're really still figuring it out yourself. So I feel like that's a really big one as well. So I just wanted to do a little bulleted list because I know going back and forth between the childhood trauma and relationships, two topics, and tying them together can be confusing, but a few of them being like growing up in an abusive environment tends to shape a person's perspective of relationships in adulthood. Survivors of childhood abuse often normalize those behaviors such as manipulation, control, and emotional violation